All right. Good afternoon, everybody. It's 3 o'clock on the 25th of July, and welcome to the International Association of Woodcarvers. Today we have a special guest with us. He's going to talk a little bit about relief carving. His name's Dustin Strenke. He has a Instagram page that is called Chiseled Outdoors. Dustin is a active police officer. He's from northern Wisconsin. He's been carving for about 5 years, and he specializes in carving wildlife relief carvings. I want to go ahead and remind you again, next week we will have Dwayne Gosnell on August the 1st. Then we'll have Bob Hershey on August the 8th. We have Jim Feather lined up for August the 15th. And it looks as though we're going to have Flex Cut. They're tentative at this point on August the 22nd. So that's the things that we have coming up in the near future. For now, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Dustin Strenke, who's going to talk a little bit about his relief carvings. Dustin, we appreciate you joining us today, and thanks for taking time out to share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm just gonna get the screen sharing going here. Can you guys see that? Oops. Just give me a sec here. There we go. I had it all figured out yesterday, but can you guys see that? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we got it.
Okay, good. Okay, so thanks for having me on. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk. So basically, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm Dustin Strenke, owner of Chiseled Outdoors, I guess you could say. 27 years old. I live in a really small town in northwest Wisconsin. Police officer, been a police officer but for about 2 years. About one of those years was full-time, so I played the part-time game a little bit. Prior to being a police officer, I was in the Marine Corps for 4 years, and I spent 2 of those years in Okinawa, Japan. So I was able to kind of travel the world and see different parts of the world, which was really cool. Been to Australia, places kind of down in that neck of the woods. So I've been carving for about 5 years. It's been hobby carving, just doing it whenever I have time, basically. Self-taught, everything I learned on my own, besides maybe some YouTube videos, things like that, but I haven't taken any sort of carving classes or anything. So I kind of wanted to mention before I got into it, is that if there's any relief carvers out there that they have a better way of doing things or something like that, just feel free to speak up, because I don't want to, send people down the wrong road, so to speak. But I think that I've learned some valuable things that I can maybe point some relief carvers, new carvers in the right direction, things like that. I don't consider myself doing anything crazy technical. It's pretty basic stuff. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. I'm going to break down one of my carvings, talk about my process and how I do things, and just the little tricks and things that I've learned over my time that I can maybe steer some people in the right direction. So I pretty much carve wildlife relief. That's my passion. I love the outdoors. Carve a lot of basswood and white pine. Lately, I've been carving a lot of white pine. I would like to experiment with different types of wood, though, and just kind of get a different feel for different things like that. But white pine is just easy for me to find. It's at all of our local sawmills and things like that, so it's just easy and cheaper for me. The majority of my stuff is done with traditional gouges. At some point, I would like to be completely self-reliant on the gouges and things, but I don't have a very large collection. I have a decent collection, but there's quite a bit of stuff done in my carvings that I need a power carver to do. But at some point, in my journey, my carving journey, I'd like to be completely self-efficient with the chisels and not even have to touch the Dremel. That's kind of my goal long term. Tell you a little bit about how I got into the craft. It's kind of an interesting story, not necessarily embarrassing, but so I was 21 years old and it was my last year in the Marine Corps. A lot of times when I was in the Marine Corps, there's not a whole lot of things to do. It's either work out or play video games. And I played a lot of video games growing up. I still like video games, but that video games were a pretty big part of my life growing up and kind of into my Marine Corps years and things like that. That's what I enjoyed to do. But basically, it was my last year, and just one day, it just a thought popped in my head. I'm like, Dustin, you could be doing something better with your time. Like, you don't need to spend all this time in video games. Like, you could be spending more quality time with your free time and actually doing something a little bit more worthwhile. So I ended up researching hobbies. And when I was a kid, I enjoyed woodworking and things like that too. My dad owned a construction business, so he had a lot of tools that I was kind of able to play with, and I'd make shelves, and I'd make dressers and nightstands and stuff for my bedroom and things like that. So my research was kind of wood related. But then the wood carving popped up in my research. I'm like, okay, that'd be kind of cool. But honestly, I can't draw at all. I'm a terrible drawer. So I didn't think I would be able to carve. I'm like, it kind of doesn't really go hand in hand. But I didn't think I could carve because I can't draw at all. So I kind of disregarded the wood carving for a while. But I eventually gave it a try and So I eventually gave it a try, and basically just at my local hobby shop, it was a really cheap wood carving set. Honestly, I don't even think it was for carving. I think it was more for like models and stuff. Basically, you could take the I guess you could say the bits out of the handle or something like that and reattach them and stuff, but it wasn't very good quality. And basically it was a terrible first experience carving. I was breaking blades off in the wood, and I'm pretty sure it was basswood too, so it's not like it was that hard of a wood. But yeah, I was breaking blades off, and I was trying to carve a coffee mug, and it was just an absolutely terrible experience. So I kind of pushed that to the side, but I kept going down the carving path because I thought that this could be something. So I ended up buying a Dremel, and I tried power carving, and it was better, but it just wasn't quite there. I just wasn't totally satisfied. I have a picture of this was my very first relief carving. This was with a Dremel. I mean, I guess I didn't think it was terrible. I think it was oak, so it was super hard, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And this was another lesson I learned the hard way. But yeah, so I didn't really like the power carving as much. I didn't like the noise. I didn't like the dust and things like that. So I kind of pushed that aside too, until I bought a file beginner carving set. And it had it was just a couple chisels. It had a V gouge and a couple of couple of regular gouges and things like that. But that was kind of when I was hooked. I was hooked on the traditional carving. This is a picture of this was my very first carving that you would consider it would be traditional, with the gouges and chisels and things like that. and I absolutely loved just the smooth feel of the gouges going through the wood, and I loved the chips that it created when you carved. And it was just, I don't know, I was just hooked, and I was addicted to it basically. And that was 5 years ago now, I think. So ever since then, I've had a carving project going. Um, so yeah, I've been hooked ever since. But I have little nuggets of lessons learned the hard way that I kind of wanted to share, to kind of maybe help point some new relief carvers, traditional carvers, in the right direction. But basically, and it's probably a lot of you're into carving already, so you kind of know this. But if somebody is listening that they're just getting into the craft, I would say buy quality tools and know what your carving niche is before you buy, because I haven't had a ton of people ask me, but I've had some that are like, well, what chisels should you buy, or something like that. And I always tell them, narrow down what your goal is to carve, because if you want to carve deep relief, you're going to need a lot of spoon gouges, and you're going to need a lot of variety of different gouges. And or if you want to carve big stuff, you're going to obviously need, you know, large millimeter gouges, 25, 30 millimeter gouges or something. Or if you want to carve, you know, small intricate stuff, you're going to need a lot of, I know it kind of sounds obvious, but I learned that the hard way, because when I bought my 6 or 7 chisels that I had, I thought I was set and I was good to go. And I had all these big designs in my head that I wanted to carve. And it just turned into a really frustrating experience, because, you know, I think the biggest gouge I had was at the time was a number 7 12 millimeter or something like that. And it was super small, but I had this big design that I wanted to do, and it ended up taking me an extremely long time just lowering the background. So I guess that would be my first little nugget, if you will, is just make sure that you buy your carving gouges that fits your niche that you want to get into. So I carve a lot of wildlife relief. That's basically my inspiration. In Northwest Wisconsin, we do a lot of hunting, fishing, stuff like that. So I love the outdoors. I'm a pretty hardcore bow hunter for whitetail deer, and I record all of my hunts. So a lot of times all you is like when I'm out walking in the woods or something like that, I'll take a picture of a leaf, or like if I'm recording one of my hunts and I see a really, really pretty scene or something like that, a lot of times I'll use that to help me with my designs, things like that. I'll trace the leaves that I took pictures of. I'll trace that and put that right into my carvings. So that's kind of where I get my inspiration and things like that. If it was up to me, I guess it's always up to me, but I would 100% carve whitetail deer. Like, that's just what I love. But lately I've been kind of trying to broaden my wood carving abilities. So I've been carving, you know, I carved a bird, a cardinal, carved a bass, just to kind of help build my understanding of different aspects of wildlife relief. Yeah, so, and then I carved my grandpa's cabin, and that was what I'm going to talk about today. And that was absolutely my favorite carving to date. I absolutely love that carving. But I'll tell you a little bit about how I get started and how I prep a carving. So the first thing I do is I have a sketch pad, and I just try to draw out a design that I'm thinking of in my head. And a lot of times these designs, they don't translate into a final sketch. But I just try to get a design on paper so I don't forget it. And they're really rough because I can't draw at all. And when I draw the sketches, I try to keep in mind, it's not an absolute rule, but I try to keep in mind the layers of the carving. So you're gonna have the foreground layer, then you're gonna have your middle layer, which is could have multiple layers in the middle layer, and then you're gonna have your background layer, and then it's called the ground plane. Basically, this is the layer that transcends, and it goes from the foreground all the way back to the background. So I have a picture here. This was my secluded survivor wood carving. Basically, the water here and the grass, that would be your ground plane. So this is the foreground, basically, and it tapers all the way back to the background. And then this would be your foreground layer here, and the buck and the trees would be your middle layer. And then the background, cattails, and the sky would be your background layer. Basically, is kind of a basic breakdown. But after I get the rough sketch all done, I figure out the size that I want the carving to be, and I get it all glued up. A lot of times I've been carving 2-inch thick white pine. That seems to be kind of my sweet spot. Basically, it gives you enough depth or enough room to work with to get decent amount of shadows and depth in the carving, but it's not too much. You know, if you get into 3 or 4 inches, I mean, that I would consider deep relief stuff. Like my stuff, I would say it's like medium relief. It's definitely more than shallow, but I wouldn't consider it deep, because yeah, deep is kind of a whole another game. But I glue it up and I get it ready to carve. And then I use freezer paper, and I cut out in an exact size of the wood that I have prepped. And I get a perfectly final sketch or final design on the freezer paper, and it's to scale. It's perfectly to scale. So then as I carve and I lose my lines, or I lose specific aspects of the carving as I go, I can reference that final sketch back to my carving on the wood, and I can redraw things, which for me is really helpful because I can't draw. So being able to do that is pretty crucial for me, especially with the carving, the Grandpa's Cabin carving, because that had a lot of straight lines, and it had to be super exact. Otherwise the carving's not going to turn out. It's not going to look like my Grandpa's Cabin. And I have a picture to show you as I get into that. But basically I get the final design ready to go, and then when I have it all figured out, I break the design down, and I break it down into layers. So I figure out what the foreground layer is, and I figure out what the middle and background layers are, and then I determine what the most important aspect of the carving is. So like in this case here, the secluded survivor, the most important aspect of this carving is the buck. If you don't get the buck right, and I'm still kind of trying to figure out the white-tailed deer, and there's some perfections that I definitely have to fix as I go. But obviously the buck is the most important aspect of the carving. So I try to, before I even start carving, I break down the thickness of the wood, and I figure out how much thickness of that layer do I need to get the look that I'm looking for, if that makes sense. So I think in this carving, the buck, that specific layer is honestly the majority of the depth of the wood. It's a good inch. Like the thickness here is 2 inches of the total wood. The buck is probably an inch and a quarter. And I try to give myself about a 1/2 inch, maybe maybe 3/8, somewhere in that area, in the back, to make sure it doesn't warp or things like that. If you're the back of the carving and your furthest depth, if it's too thin, you're going to get some bad warping. And I learned that the hard way too. I have some carvings that are warping, things like that, because I didn't give myself a solid backdrop. But yeah, so the buck is about 1.25 inches in that area. So the most important aspect, I try to give the most amount of wood that I can. And then it's kind of just a general rule. It's not an absolute rule, but the layers closest to the viewer, the foreground layer, and then aspects of the middle layer, those are in general are the layers that need the most amount of wood, because that has the most. They're up close, and so you're going to need more wood to get the design that you're going to need more wood to get depth and things like that. So then I transfer the design that I have, the final design I have, I transfer that onto the wood using graphite paper. The stuff, I just get it at Hobby Lobby, and it lasts a really long time. I think I got mine like 2 or 3 years ago, and I can reuse sheets and things like that. So that for me is the best way to transfer to the design from the paper onto the wood. And I have a number 2. This is my number 2 little nugget that I have of things I learned the hard way is know your gouge's limits, and don't or avoid designing a project that's beyond your gouge's abilities. This kind of goes back to similar to my first little thing I mentioned, but I had these big designs that I wanted to do, but there were some spots that I really struggled with because I didn't have the gouge that fit, or my gouges didn't have the ability to carve that area. So like this carving, it's called Shoreline Funnel. Like this deep stuff in here was extremely difficult to carve. I just didn't have the gouges to be able to do that, and I was able to use my Dremel, which kind of saved me. But if I were to redo this carving again, I wouldn't have had these deep spots. I would have pushed these leaves and these acorns back up into this larger block of leaves here, and I would have done the same here. I'd have pushed those in to just alleviate some of these deep spots that were really difficult to carve. And same with this one. It was difficult to get into the behind the foreground cattails with the background cattails, getting into these deep spots here. I just didn't have the gouges. So when I go forward now and I create new things, I keep in mind my gouge collection and what I have, and I try to adjust the design to fit my gouge's abilities, so that I don't run into these problems. So I'll kind of get into the cabin carving here now. So this was my grandpa's cabin. He recently passed away, so I wanted to carve his cabin kind of in memory of him. So basically, and it really worked out nice because I had a picture to reference from. So I was able to really get a good design from his picture, because there's no way I would be able to draw that. There's no way. So basically, I'll kind of get into my carving process here. So the first step, this picture has a couple of steps already done, but the first step is to establish the depth of the different layers, and then outline them, lower the layers down to their respective depths. A lot of times when I outline, I do it really rough. I give myself about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch from the design of the cabin. We're just going to use the cabin for an example. I give myself about 1/8 to 1/4 all the way around, and that allows me just some wiggle room, so I don't carve in, like if I slip or something like that, I don't carve into the cabin, or if I maybe go a little bit too far, you know, I don't have any gouge marks into the cabin. So then I do a rough outline. I push the background back in as far as I feel I need to go. So in this particular carving, I kind of broke it down, and I thought the cabin obviously is the most important layer, so it needs the most amount of wood. That makes sense. So I gave myself about 1 inch, probably 1.25 inches, to work with. So I dropped and I outlined down to 1.25 inches all the way around the cabin, and then I lowered the background back to that. And then once I do that, I do a precise outline. And this is another reason why I leave the 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 when I do a rough outline, is because it makes it easier when I do the precise outline to get as vertical as possible. So in this particular picture, it's already done. The precise outline is already done. I've already started shaping the cabin. But right along the line, I do a precise outline all the way around. And it's really important in this step to be as vertical as you possibly can. If you end up undercutting or slope out, when you start shaping the cabin later, it's going to throw off, it's going to throw the look off. And it's like, if, for an example, if you undercut, you're going to end up making the cabin skinnier as you slowly lower the background. So it's better if you do one accidentally, it's better to slope out, because you can fix that later, basically. And a lot of times, just to save time, it's not necessary to precisely outline certain elements, like the treetops here. It's not, you don't have to get it precise, because it's leaves. So basically, after the precise outline, then I start shaping it. And this corner right here was very crucial as kind of my reference corner. Everything, all my measurements and everything were based off of this corner. And this corner is basically at the foreground of the wood. And I just taper back from that point back to the lowest amount of wood that I gave myself. In this particular situation, I think I said about 1 inch to 1.25 inches. And I give myself a little bit of room so then I can undercut the cabin later. So I give myself about 1/8 to maybe 1/4, so then I can undercut that later. So then from this corner, I then tapered back to this corner, and it's not really the depth here. Basically, the deeper that you go, the more dramatic lighting you're going to have, if that makes sense. So the design is what's going to kind of create the perspective to the viewer. So I didn't have to go as deep here, but I wouldn't have gotten as dramatic of a lighting difference, if that makes sense. And same with the roof. I just reestablished the roof line, and I tapered that back to the background. And that again is similar. I didn't have to go as deep, but the deeper you go, the more dramatic lighting you're going to have and lighting difference you're going to have. So I use as much of the wood as I possibly can, and as much of the wood as I give myself. And then I left a little chunk of wood here, because that's going to be a flower box. I carved a flower box later, but I needed a little bit amount of wood in there to work with to do that. Does see here. So then this is after I have gotten the rough shaping all ready to go and done, and I don't feel I need to do any more. And then I sanded it down to get a flat surface. And it was important to, as you shape, to not just take small strokes. If you take big strokes, you're going to end up having to go down to the deepest stroke you did, and it could throw it off. So yeah, just be careful on how much you take off, I guess, in this particular carving. And then what I do after I do the rough shaping, and I think I'm kind of ready to move on to the next step, is you establish layers within the layer, if that makes sense. So in this particular situation, the porch, this wall here, that's a layer within the middle cabin layer, if that makes sense. So then I pushed that back, and then I tapered to get the lighting difference here. I tapered from this point back to the depth that I carved it. And again, the design is what is going to help the viewer get the perspective. But so basically, just the further back you go, the more lighting difference you're going to have. And usually I carve, it's honestly very similar to whittling. I mean, you take big chunks and you slowly kind of work your way through and get down to the details last. So basically that was the major layer within that layer. So I did that first, and then I started to slowly shape as I went. So here I carved the railings and the wood box here, and later I'm going to be carving in the window and doors, but it's such a thin amount of wood that I need that it's not really going to be that big of a difference. It's not going to really matter. I guess if anybody has any questions, I've been kind of rambling on for a while, so if you have any questions, just shoot them out. Any questions so far? No? Okay. Is everybody still there?
Yeah, we're good. Keep going, Dustin.
Okay. So yeah, basically I'm just slowly, now I'm kind of starting to detail, getting the windows in and the doors. And then I carved the flowerwood box here, carved this little window up here. I really take my time, and in this detailing aspect of the cabin, I spent a lot of time transferring the design onto the wood, because the perspective or the design, that's what's going to make it. If your design is off, your carving is going to be off. So I spent quite a bit of time making sure that the door was right and the windows were right. Basically, I just spent a lot of time transferring the design back onto the wood, making sure these openings were proportional with the actual cabin, things like that.
Hey, Dustin, somebody wanted to confirm
So
this is all without power tools. Is that correct?
That's correct. Up to this point, the only power tools I used were carving the flower texture in the flower box. Otherwise, it's all been done with traditional gouges.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yep. So basically, I'm just kind of slowly detailing the cabin here, and a lot of times with carvings, it's best, and it's with whittling too, but it's best to do your shaping, all of your shaping first, and then do your detailing. So I guess technically I kind of broke that rule with this one. So I should have just shaped the cabin. I should have roughed in the trees in the background, and shaped the treetops. I should have done all my shaping first, but the reason I did the cabin first and I detailed the entire cabin was because that was the most important aspect of the carving. And if I didn't get it right, then I was just going to scrap it. If I didn't get the cabin right, I was just going to throw it away. So I didn't want to spend a ton of time in the treetops and things that I know I'll be able to do. It's not that difficult. So I wanted to get the cabin done, make sure it's what I want before I moved on to other aspects of the carving. Basically, that was kind of my mentality. So yeah, I'm just kind of slowly detailing here now. Just one sec here. And then I'm starting to work on the background layer, which is the trees, and then the ground plane that's slowly going to taper back into the trees, and I'll establish, there's some pictures later on where I'll establish where the trees and the ground plane layer connect. And this was an area where I struggled. I had to use some power carving here because some of these gaps in between the trees were really small and they were pretty deep, and I didn't have any skinny spoon gouges. So I had to use some power carving here to get the depth of the trees that I wanted. And here you can see I connected the background tree layer with the ground plane layer here. And then the main goal in this right now is just to not nick the cabin. Like that was my 100% goal. Is like with this here, this was really scary doing this because, you know, if I nicked one of these posts or something like that, I mean, it'd be done. I mean, it would be difficult to fix. And then up here, you know, getting close to the roof line and things like that, it was just kind of scary because I had it all detailed, so I didn't want to nick it. So that was my goal throughout this whole thing, was just don't nick or slip and carve into the cabin at all, because that would be terrible. And I think I maybe skipped a step here, but basically probably the most important step, at least I think, and it kind of is what separates relief carvers and things like that from like CNC machines, if you would say, is the undercut. Like the undercut is the absolute most important cut in relief carving, I think, because it separates the layers, it creates more shadows and depth in the carving. So I just undercut the cabin to really separate it from the tree layer, if that makes sense. But yeah, the undercut, it takes a ton of time, and it's not necessarily very fun. It's very, very time consuming, and it's just, I don't know, it's just really can be difficult to be done, but it's definitely worth it. And you can kind of do select undercutting, if that makes sense, to maybe save some time because it takes so long. And just undercut the most important elements of the carving. So the cabin here, and then I undercutted in the future, I undercut this here to establish, you know, the separation from the cabin and these, it's kind of like an immature bush or trees here. But I didn't undercut the treetops, or I didn't really undercut the trees here. I didn't think it was as necessary, and it would have taken a ton of time. So sorry, I kind of passed that step, but yeah, that's probably the most important step, in my opinion, to relief carving. So basically, I'm just slowly detailing here, adding the bark texture, and I did that with a Dremel. A lot of my detailing, like the leaves and things like that, the bark is done with the Dremel. Yeah, so here I'm just slowly detailing the treetops. I use a gouge first, and I break it up, just make random kind of strokes to break it up and create some big shadows. And then I slowly come back with the Dremel and kind of just make small little shallow strokes, creating that random leaf aspect. And the same thing over here, I made with the gouge. I made big chunks, big shadows first. And then I came back with the Dremel and made smaller shadows. So this is it done. The carving aspect is done. Then I usually put a border around it, just a simple border. It's nothing fancy. And then honestly, probably my biggest struggle in all of my carvings, and I still have yet to figure it out, is the finishing stage of the carving. Because of the nature of carving, it's difficult to sand evenly. So a lot of times, and it's probably my own fault for carving white pine. That's probably one of the biggest problems I'm having, is I'm getting blotching, and I'm getting it's not evenly taking the stain. But they turn out fine, but that's the finishing aspect of my process is what I need to probably work on the most. Here, let me see here. Yeah, so this is it all done. Hopefully hopefully I hit everything. Hopefully it was easy to follow. What are your guys' thoughts? Do you have any questions? I guess I'm pretty much done with my presentation here.
So Dustin, do you ever put any kind of color or anything on the pieces that you carve? Is it mostly just stain?
I've it's mostly just stain. I've thought about painting, but it's not that, like, that's honestly kind of a scary thought to me, because I spend so much time in the carving process and getting it all carved that I don't want to ruin it by trying to paint it, because I can't paint. So I would have to make smaller stuff and just really practice and things like that. And kind of my mentality, the reason why I love relief is I love the depth and the shadows that it creates. And I feel, I mean, no taking away to anybody that paints their relief carvings, but me just personally, I like the wood look. And I like the depth and the shadows that it creates. And I think that if you paint it, it kind of, you kind of lose a little bit of the shadows and stuff. But
do you do
I
anything?
have a question. Oh, sorry.
Well, I was going to ask about your shadow box and how you had the lighting and everything. Like, do you do anything beforehand to kind of see where your lighting's going to be, or is that just how everything goes? I mean, is there any planning beforehand on how the lighting hits in with that shadow box?
yeah, basically where I carve I have a carving table, and it's kind of tilted up. It's more of, I don't even know what degree it would be, 60 degrees or 75 or something. So it's almost straight up and down, and I have overhead lighting to that. So that lets me kind of see where the shadows are, and it gives me a good kind of perspective of how the carving is turning out as I carve, because I can see the shadows with the overhead lighting.
Because it looked like when you were starting, the way you had it all planned out, you had a section over the cabin that little more light was coming through. I didn't know if that was an intentional, that you wanted to, use that to focus in on the cabin, which of course it is. If that was intentionally set up, or if that's just how it happened with the tree lines.
Yeah, honestly, that's just how it happened. I didn't intentionally do that, but yeah, it just kind of worked out good, I guess. It's just how it worked out.
This is a great tribute to your grandfather. Looks great.
Thank you. Sarah, did you have a question?
I just wanted to compliment him on his work.
No, I'm sorry, Sarah. I thought she tuned in earlier.
I think it was Kaylee.
Kelly? Oh, I can't. Yeah.
What was that?
Were you going to ask a question?
Oh, I was actually going to ask about lighting as well. But it looks like Tracy had also asked about the finished size of the carving.
Okay. This one is, I think it's about a foot by maybe like 20 inches. It's not super big.
Thanks. It's beautiful.
Yep. Thank you.
So Dustin, if someone was going to start relief carving, what would you recommend someone trying? What would be an easy thing to start with, in your opinion?
I guess just getting into relief, I would say just simple stuff, just one layer stuff, like just know and understand kind of the grain of the wood and the direction that you have to properly carve. Like lately I've been carving kind of one layer stuff because it allows me to kind of focus on more of the details and things like that. And it takes me less time. Like this carving, it took me probably 40 hours. And I just kind of whittle away at it here and there, an hour here, half hour there kind of thing. But a lot of times it takes me, a month or two to get a carving done. So so I would recommend smaller projects, one layer stuff, and just slowly work your way into more complex things. Just get the basics done. I think there's some good YouTube stuff that you can watch. I think his name is Joe Dillette. He has a ton of great content on like even just carving like a pear or something like that, and just understand the what am I trying to say here? How you should be carving properly, basically, if that makes sense. That's like a super generic answer. Yeah, but I would just say simple stuff. Just understand the basics.
Dustin, do you give consideration to the wood grain when you're laying out something like this? It looks like most of your design is vertical, but it might be horizontal to the grain. Does that play into your carving?
Sometimes with this one, there's not a ton of because this wood is horizontal, but there's not a ton of weak spots, if that makes sense. Like the trees were, like you could kind of consider them maybe potentially weak because they're going perpendicular to the grain. The biggest problem were these posts here. They're probably my weakest point of the carving. I do keep that thought in mind, but I don't really base my my goal off of the grain direction. Here, let me see if I have a.
Dustin, I have a quick question.
Sure.
did you, when you were carving this, did you find it more difficult, more challenging to carve the irregular shapes or the crisp straight line parts of it?
Probably the crisp straight lines. I actually bought I didn't have any bench gouges or bench chisels, so I ended up having to buy a couple just specifically for this because I wanted to make sure my lines were really straight with the cabin. But I would definitely say the straight lines, because if it's off, then it's so much easier to see. If you don't get it straight, it's so much easier to tell with the treetops and stuff. It's easier to get that random look. That's just kind of how it is, I guess. But yeah, I would definitely say the straight lines were more difficult.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
What do you use to like make sure that your angles are right? So your proportions in the drawing, like on the cabin, like so that you get the depths properly? Do you use like a compass or something?
Yeah, I correct me if I mispronounce this, but I use a caliper, or is it caliper or something like that, where you can spread it apart, and that's where my to scale design is super important, because I was able to use the caliper, and as I shaped it, I lost all my lines, so I was able to reestablish the design back onto the wood using the caliper, or the caliper, whatever. But that was a big help. I wouldn't have been able to carve this near to close to the cabin if I didn't have that. Oh, okay. I didn't know I could do this. I see there's some chat stuff here. Yeah, the grain is running horizontally in this piece here.
So even though the trees are up and down, it's better to have the wood horizontal to be able to carve the trees in that detail, or does it matter?
Basically, what I do is the like in this carving, it's long horizontally, so I just have the grain running instead of, because in this particular piece I would have to probably splice, if I wanted the grain vertical, I'd have to splice, three pieces probably together to get that, and I would prefer not having any splices at all if possible. So that's why I chose to do it this way. It's just easier.
But it doesn't mess
I
up.
had a spare piece.
It doesn't mess up the ability to get the detail, even though it's running horizontally instead of vertically.
Not really. Well, that's why I kind of had to use the Dremel, because with the pine, it's difficult. It's more difficult to get the detail. So it is true that the horizontal, especially when I was carving the bark and things like that, like I would have to have extremely sharp chisels, and even then it would be difficult. You'd start kind of chipping away, and things would kind of flake, basically, if that makes sense. So that's why I detailed some of it with the Dremel. So it affects it a little bit, but I'd rather have that, I guess, than a bunch of splices in my carving. Like this one was vertical. The grain was vertical, and that worked out nicely because a lot of the carving aspects were vertical. So you're going to have a little problem if it's perpendicular and things like that, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's a problem of concern. You just gotta kind of think about about it. Like this one was horizontal, and this I carved this before I kind of really knew anything. And the antlers turned out, I was really happy with the way the antlers turned out. And it worked out nicely because they were right behind the tree. So I had some strength basically there to hold the antlers nicely. But this one was difficult because I wanted to undercut the antlers, but basically you can kind of see in between these two antlers and these two that there's some wood in here. I left that in there because that it gives the antler strength. If I were to try to undercut this completely, the antlers would, even with it vertical, they would break just because it's pine. If you carve something a little bit more harder, you could maybe get away with that. But yeah.
So and I think there's another question there about the depth and how you figure out how much wood you leave for things like tree trunks.
Yeah.
Do you decide your layers, I guess, during your design process?
So let's see here. So with the cabin, I'll go back to the finished product here. So I break the layer down, the layers down, and decide what the most important aspect is. So to me, that's the important part, and the trees and things that can be, it's not as crucial. Basically, the trees here, I think I have about 1/4 of an inch of wood to maybe 3/8. But the depth of the cabin was the most important part. The trees you can kind of get away with. Basically, they if you have a little less wood with the trees, they might look a little flat. But me, I would rather have the depth for the cabin and a little, maybe a little flat trees versus, the cabin doesn't look right, but my trees, they look, pretty round. Basically, so I kind of weigh the pros and cons and what's important in the project, if that makes sense. There's no like right answer of depth. The deeper you go, the more wood you have to work with, and the rounder they'll look. But I chose the cabin as priority, so if that makes sense. And this is something I wanted to mention that I forgot to. A lot of carvers or some relief carvers, they'll work foreground to background, and some will work background to foreground. I personally like to work foreground to background because if I need more wood with a particular layer, I can take it without ruining what I already carved, if that makes sense. So if you carve the background layer first, and then you start working your way out, and you get to the layer in the foreground, and you're like, oh, I maybe need more wood to get the look that I'm looking for, but you're gonna have to kind of ruin what you already carved in order to do that. So that's why I basically work foreground in. That makes sense.
All right. Any other questions for Dustin? Okay, Dustin, that looks like that's all the questions for today. So I want to say thank you again for presenting to us. Very interesting stuff, and your cabin's fantastic. So you should be very proud of that. Thanks again for joining us. Once again, I will remind everyone, next week we will have Dwayne Gosnell on. He'll be talking about his carving journey and talk a little bit about rough outs and what you can do with those. On the 8th, we'll have Bob Hershey. Bob Hershey will be on talking about carving animals and his painting technique. He paints with oil-based paint instead of acrylics. So he'll be talking a little bit about that. We'll have Jim Feather on the 15th. Jim is a caricature carver, and he'll be talking a little bit about carving expression. And then on the 22nd, tentatively, we will have Flex Cut. We're still working on trying to line out the presenter for them. So Flex Cut tentatively will be on the 22nd. So that's who we have coming up. If anybody has any suggestions as far as people you would like to present, let us know, and we'll try to reach out to those people. There's no guarantee that the people that you suggest will agree to come on and talk to us, but we'll definitely pursue those people. Also, I wanted to bring to your attention one thing. We had Helvey Tools on, I think the third week that we presented, maybe the fourth week. Helvey's having a sale this afternoon of the drake tools that they make. So if anybody's interested in purchasing a drake gouge or tool and you haven't been able to do that, jump on Facebook on their page at 7 o'clock tonight, and they'll be having that sale. I talked to Rich earlier today, and he said be sure to let everyone know, and if you want to come out to buy something, make sure that you request to be a participant on their Facebook page so that you can join that sale. So again, that's 7 o'clock tonight. And if anybody has anything else, let us know. If not, we'll meet again next Saturday at 3 p.m. Again, we'll have Dwayne Gosnell on. He'll be talking about his carving journey and talking about roughouts. Anything else?